Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Belenzon. I'm a strategy professor at Fuqua. My main research investigates the role of business in advancing science and innovation more broadly. I'll be answering your questions today at the end of the talk after about 20 minutes, so please leave them in the comment section. Okay, so we'll talk about the US ecosystem, how it is changing, and what are the consequences this might have for the ability of the US to compete in the long term, maybe especially with China. Look, there's no doubt that the US is at the forefront of science and technology. The leadership of American universities in disciplines such as physics, chemistry, medicine, is evident, for instance, in the share of Nobel Prizes that Americans have won in these fields. Also, American corporations have made many major contributions to science. We all know about AT&T's Bell Labs, the home of the transistor, the laser, information theory, many Nobel Prizes coming from AT&T, 14 to be precise, and 5 Turing Awards coming from American corporations. The golden age or the rise of American research was mostly pronounced after World War II, where essentially America became the undisputed technology leaders. Also, companies such as Intel, Xerox, IBM, Microsoft, Genentech created entire new industries in the past few decades. Today, American corporations dominate in artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and other science-based industries, so everything is great. But some people and some evidence are raising very significant concerns that maybe our greatness today is essentially a reflection of the past and not really a reflection or predictor of the future. I'm going to kind of give you one example of, or two examples of such concerns or such evidence. For example, productivity growth in the United States have been going down. Real GDP per hour, also known as labor productivity, grew substantially in the middle of the 20th century, from 1.8% per year between 1870 and 1920 to 2.8% per year between 1920 and 1970. But from 1970, we have been growing only at 1.6%. The lowest we have been growing during that period. Also, the US government support for R&D essentially has halved from 1.5% of GDP to 2.7%. What is especially interesting, at least for us in the research that we do, that investment by Americans, by essentially the American government in total in science, in scientific research, actually increased. And this essentially creates this big puzzle. Why are we kind of growing more slowly in an era where we are investing more and more in scientific research? What is also important to note before we're going to go more in detail, in several key emerging technologies and industries, there is evidence we are falling behind. China is either rapidly catching up, like in AI, for instance, or racing ahead of the US, like in green tech and fintech. For example, in renewable energy, Chinese firms produce 72% of the world's solar models, 70% of its lithium batteries, and 45% of wind turbines. So what we are asking in our research agenda, which I'm going to go over with you relatively quickly in the next 15 minutes, is essentially we're trying to understand what does the future hold for American innovation? Will America win the technological race with China, or is America's current dominance more a reflection of its past success than its current trajectory moving forward to the future? So to make some educated guesses on what the future may hold for American innovation, we must first understand how the American innovation ecosystem has changed during the 20th century. Our work explains how innovation has been organized around different sectors of the economy, from big firms, very big firms, small firms, VC-backed firms, universities, and the government, and how the structure of the ecosystem has changed, and why should it matter for innovation and competitive advantage. So what do we know? Well, what are the kind of bottom line that I would like you to kind of take away from this talk? Over time, the American innovation ecosystem has become increasingly specialized. America has moved from an economy where big firms did both scientific research and development activities towards one with a starker division of labor or innovative labor, where corporations specialize in development, engineering work, and universities specialize in research. One manifestation of these changes has been the withering of many large corporate labs, such as Xerox PARC and Bell Labs, which historically have played key roles in translating cutting-edge research into new technologies, but today they hardly exist. In our research, for example, we show that American firms published in scientific journals about half as many papers in 2015 than they published in 1980. If you want to take one example, just to make this kind of trend more concrete, take DuPont. DuPont is a poster child of how great scientific research in corporations can be. DuPont was the kind of corporate research of DuPont was established in 1903. And its research essentially rivaled the top academic chemistry departments in the world. For example, in the 60s, the DuPont Central R&D Unit published more articles in the Journal of the American Chemical Society than MIT and Caltech combined. However, since the 90s, DuPont attitudes toward research has changed, with investors and managers finding these research activities less attractive. And in 2016, the company essentially shut down completely its research activities. Why do we care about all this stuff? Well, this more specialized innovation ecosystem is geared toward efficiency and profit maximization. Some would argue short-term profit maximization. Startups and technologies that do not fulfill their promises are quickly liquidated by venture capital investors. The resulting natural selection provides strong incentives for performance and promotes an efficient allocation of capital. Venture capital investors also spread their bets widely while granting their firms significant autonomy. This encourages diversity and experimentation, which is great. But at the same time, large corporations tend to concentrate on projects that fit with their existing businesses. Due to internal politics, they also find it difficult to withdraw resources from failing projects. Many firms have concluded that carrying out significant amount of research in-house in this environment where you have so much opportunities from the outside might not be beneficial to the bottom line, which means they have withdrawn from investing in research themselves. Our analysis points out that while specialization has benefits in the form of high productivity and efficiency, because once we specialize, we become better at what we do, there are also substantial costs. And this cost might be more significant in some areas than others. Specifically, if we think about complex projects that require the mobilization of large-scale resources from one sector in the economy into other sectors of the economy, we might expect that such mobilization will be more difficult in a more fragmented, more specialized ecosystem, which we have today. And later on, I'm going to show you two examples of where America is falling behind and why we think that this falling behind is related to how we organize our innovation ecosystem today, especially relative to how we used to do it in the past. So what I'm going to do, let's kind of jump into some more detail. I'm going to show you some nice pictures, and then we go back to have a discussion. So I'm going to share the screen with you now. So this is just a very quick summary of what I said before. You can see here on the right-hand side the decline we've seen in growth rates, while at the same time we've been seeing much more research being invested in the US. This is the left-hand side. The clear question that we want to ask is how come they're growing much, much less fast as we used to, given that we invest much more resources to scientific research at the economy level. So in our research, and we have kind of written a lot about that, including book chapters and papers, if you want to know more details, we kind of explain that you can summarize the ecosystem in the US, the evolution of the ecosystem into 4 different periods. I'm going to focus mostly on the rise of corporate research from the 1900s until what is happening today. What is really interesting is if we think about the early period of American kind of innovation, The US firms, while the US was essentially the wealthiest country in the world by the early of the by 1914, actually, before the First World War, most of this wealth was created not through innovation, mostly not through scientific research, but mostly by essentially borrowing or stealing or essentially taking research and discoveries from other countries, mostly Germany and the UK. And this is a nice summary, this kind of quote is a nice summary of what American big firms thought about scientific research. Let me just kind of read it out loud. I'm fully convinced that it is not now, and never will pay commercially to keep establishment of professional inventors or of men whose chief business is to invent. This was essentially AT&T, which later on, as you know, founded Bell Labs that became the greatest greatest corporate research institution in the world. So there was essentially this understanding that research should not be done by big firms. This is the railroad companies that essentially use research mostly to kind of test materials for like different purposes, but not advance science themselves. This has changed in the early 1900s. And it has changed for various reasons. One key reason is that the US government decided that it should essentially not allow American firms to buy easily other companies, meaning that if American firms wanted to grow, they had to do research themselves. They had to find new sources of growth based on their own internal research, other than just buying things from the outside. But there were other reasons as well. But the key thing to understand is that from 1900s up to like 1930, almost every big American firm in the US decided that it's time to organize scientific research inside big firms. It's time to pay for this research with our own profits, with our own money. And these are like some of the examples from DuPont, GE, Bell Labs, Kodak, essentially every big American firm. This one, the kind of picture on the bottom is the DuPont experimental lab. They also called the Purity Hall because of its pure research. As I told you, today it's dead, it's gone. And you see that in a very short period of time, there was a tremendous reorganization of innovation in the US economy, moving from small independent inventors like Edison into large-scale corporate research organizations. Things went well until 1940, but after the Great War, after the Second World War, maybe for the first time, it has been really, really understood. The value of science was really understood because essentially science won the war, people might say. And after the World War, the American government decided that science is the way forward for America. Tremendous new investment by the federal government in different kind of agencies that we can discuss a bit later. Part of it went to the universities, part of it directly funded by the government, and part of it went in various forms to the corporate labs themselves. And this is what we call the golden age of American research. All the sectors of the ecosystem were geared towards supporting science. And this is essentially, where we had these great labs that we discussed before. And not only great labs, great Nobel Prizes. These are examples of Nobel Prizes coming directly from those labs. These labs essentially did so many things and in so many different places and areas. For example, the processors that run our computers consist of integrated circuits that were pioneered by Texas Instruments, a guy managed by Jack Kilby. Integrated circuits, also collections of transistors that were invented, as you know, by Bell Lab scientists. The laser beams that encode our Zoom call today, and the optical fibers that carry it across the world, I don't know where you are located, were researched by companies like TRG, GE, IBM, and Bell, as well as Corning. The GUI that frames your Zoom window was based on research at Xerox PARC. So these inventions from the 60s and 70s really allows us to do what we do today. And what is really interesting, guys, look at this picture. It's really sad. This kind of Bell Labs in 1963 versus Bell Labs in 2020. So starting from the mid, and this is what we show in various research papers, that this essentially has changed drastically. If you look, for instance, on this blue line, it shows a decline in research in publications over time by corporations. On the other hand, we see an increase in patenting, which is a measure of more development activities. If this is like a picture that summarizes some of the research we did on the value of research. We also showed that not only companies did less research activities by funds was also less valuable by both stock markets as well as managers when they decided how much to pay for the acquisitions they've made. So there are different reasons for why this happened, why American corporations decided to withdraw from research. You can, think of many. We focus on division of innovative labor and the rise of universities as a relatively cheap way to get access to science. And what I want to focus on in the next few minutes is essentially try to understand, should we be kind of concerned? Are there any reason to be concerned by this changes ecosystem? And I'm going to do this by essentially showing you two examples. So one sector where America is very strong is AI. And one thing that I'd like to kind of point out and emphasize in the context of AI and Google's investment in AI is that since the beginning of this decade, large corporations, not only Google, but IBM, Facebook, and others invested heavily in AI research. And they've made tremendous advancements, both in algorithms, but also in the implementation of the algorithms on large scale, solving specific problems, and developing complementary resources. This kind of picture shows you how dominant Google was in this space. But what I want to I like to pay attention to this kind of slide, which I think is really interesting and makes an important point. That look how many people collaborated on Google's natural machine and newer machine for translation, which has been very successful. Tremendous amount of people coming from different areas, from stats, mathematics, computers. In addition to that, Google also created the tensor processing unit that was essentially very essential to support the complex calculations that this algorithm required to do. The point is that Google very successfully was able to combine interdisciplinary research with the development of advanced complementary assets to make this science available. The point is, it's really hard to expect universities to be able to do the same because universities are highly specialized and they're not organized in similar ways that allows you to bring together different parts of the ecosystem. So if you think that the rise of universities is going to compensate for the loss of corporate research, well, maybe, but there are also reasons to be worried, and this is one example. Now, let's kind of look at an industry where America is falling behind, and this is clean tech. And I'll try to essentially give you a sense of why we think America is falling behind in this sector. I'll do it very quickly, but clearly I can take questions at the end. So just this slide, America is, in terms of investment, China is investing more in clean tech than the US, renewable energy. US is really like way below many of the countries on this list in terms of percentage from GDP and how much it invests in research. And what is really interesting, many of us invest in Tesla, especially in recent years. Look at all these companies. They have great kind of, these are all Chinese farms, great looking cars. And if we think about who's going to win, who's going to be the next Chinese Tesla, you might be surprised that it's going to be this car. It's maybe not the prettiest car out there, but what is really interesting is if you can guess how much it costs $4,200. So the Chinese companies realized that they can essentially take something that started in the US and with a different ecosystem, which I'm going to show you in a second, they can kind of leapfrog the US, not only in terms of technology, but also in terms of affordability and in terms of making it essentially scalable. And so what is so unique about the ecosystem of electric vehicle? Think about the ecosystem. Think about how integrated this ecosystem is. If you want to produce electric vehicles, you need to worry about three main things, which is the infrastructure, the technology, and regulations. And the state-managed capitalism in China allows for a very strong coordination of these activities, something that is very difficult to do in the US, that is highly specialized, and essentially each company in each sector has less connections to other sectors. So let's kind of jump back now to, let me just go stop sharing the screen and jump back to the talk. And I can now, before talking about the policy implications, I can do this in a response for questions, or I can essentially do it now. Just see if there are any questions. Yeah, so let me kind of take two questions, and then I can, because I do want to talk about the policy implications. It's one of the issues, so I'm going to read the question by John. Is one of the issues in the decrease in relative productivity gains versus investment in the US, because while we invent it here, we export the manufacturing processes mostly outside of the US? John, it's a great question. We are working on a research that actually investigates this question exactly. I can tell you one thing. Tesla currently manufactures 70% of its kind of components in China. There was last week, I think it was last week, a New York Times article saying they want to move up to 100%. And I think the implication is that if you manufacture everything in China, at some point the Chinese are going to have their own Tesla. So I think it's a great question, and we can talk about this for like at least 30 minutes. Sam, isn't it true that the trend has been shifting R&D and innovation from large corporations to startups and entrepreneurship, given capital investment in startups has risen tremendously? It's a great question as well, Sam. So the question is, can we rely on small VC-backed firms to substitute for these big kind of institutions, corporate institutions where we used to have? My personal, so what, based on our research and based on what I think the answer is unfortunately no. The way we think about VC-backed firms, we think about them as translating university research, translating research coming from the university and making it more applicable to corporations that unfortunately no longer have the ability to understand scientifically what university professors and researchers produce. So we think about VCs as bridging the gap in the ecosystem between the universities and the firms, but we don't think about them as much as producing science at scale and in nature that is similar to the great advancements we've had in the past. So I'll kind of take a few minutes, unless there are more questions from the audience, on the policy implications. So, you know, it's clearly tempting, at least for the older people in this kind of Zoom call, to think about, you know, hankering for the past and hoping that we can go back and rebuild these great institutions that brought us this tremendous growth. But I think, or we think that corporate research is falling out of favor with investors and also with managers. And we don't think we can convince managers and investors to kind of bring them back. So instead, let's focus on what can we do to essentially try to make our ecosystem work better in areas where we are falling behind. Now, again, going back to the beginning, remember, America is great, and we have a great innovation ecosystem. But the point that we are making is that it is great in some sectors, but we are falling behind in others. And we want to be excellent in all sectors, especially in those complex kind of technologies that require mobilization, more patience, and more coordination. So what can we do? So one solution is for the public sector to step in and mitigate market failure by financing promising startups in the physical sciences to push to reach technical objectives, essentially give more time for complex technologies that VCs do not really fund, give more time for these technologies to essentially come to fruition. We have the SBIR grant program at the Department of Energy, for instance, that funds renewable energies. We need a bit more, and we need to essentially help entrepreneurs or science-based entrepreneurs early on in their education when they want to essentially commercialize or try to bring to market some of their inventions. And there is really interesting advancements and policy proposals that people have been proposing recently. Universities can also do more to nurture scientific entrepreneurship. For instance, Silicon Road at Berkeley Lab and Runway at Cornell Tech both provide research fellowship for postdoctoral scientists and engineers to focus on essentially commercializing their science-based inventions. Other kind of countries have followed suit. Research institutions in Canada, Germany, also providing fellowships specifically for scientists in material sciences, not in other areas which are funded by VCs, giving them fellowship to develop their ideas and try to commercialize them a bit more. Another possible set of solutions might be related to corporate governance, and there have been a lot of very interesting advancements there. As we discussed, corporate research fell out of favor with investors and managers, maybe because it is very risky to develop. An alternative, again, it's not mutually exclusive. We can essentially try to incentivize more patient capital. And there have been some policy aspects around that, not only with respect to science, but innovation more broadly. Examples are loyalty shares or government venture funds, and there are really interesting research on that. And I really encourage you to, if you're interested in this topic, to read more about what governments can do, both by investing directly in companies, as well as loyalty shares that can incentivize different types of shareholders differently depending on whether they are short-term or long-term. And finally, I think it's really interesting today to think about the role of antitrust enforcement. So if you look back at the beginning, why companies started to do research is because it was difficult for companies to acquire other firms. If we introduce similar policies today and make it more difficult for companies to acquire knowledge from the outside, and maybe even worse, to acquire companies from the outside and then just to kill them so they don't threaten them in the future, by essentially imposing more policies around those issues, we might actually convince companies to go back and try to engage in the activities that made America great scientifically and technologically from the 60s and 70s. So let me just summarize what we think is happening. Let me just see if there are any more questions before I summarize. Okay, so yes, we have one. What about innovation in pharmaceuticals? Does US still lead there in terms of bringing new medications to market? A great question. Actually, pharma and biotech and life sciences, as we know with Pfizer, is essentially a place where the US ecosystem works really well. So if we can think about IT on one side and then life sciences being on the other side, there's two sectors where America is working great. What is missing is what is in the middle, the kind of more material sciences, renewables, etc. And this is where policy should focus on. Why exactly, material sciences are working less well, and what makes IT and ICT and life science and life sciences better suited to a specialized economy. And we don't have time to talk about, but we have an HBR article on that. So if you just Google my name and HBR, you can reach us on that, some interesting thoughts we had on this issue. So this is a great question. So I'm essentially almost out of time. What do I want you to remember? Our ecosystem has changed drastically. We became much more specialized. Specialization and efficiency have many advantages. These advantages, we see them really well in ICT and life sciences, but at the same time, we are falling behind in other industries and sectors where efficiency and short-term profits might actually impede progress. And these industries, the example I gave you is electric vehicles. Those industries need much more coordination and much more patience in bringing new kind of life-changing technologies to market. This is where we are falling behind, and this is why, in our opinion, more government intervention is required along the dimensions that we have here. And again, if you want to know more, just email me and I'll be happy to kind of talk more and give you more resources if you're interested in this topic. So this is what I wanted to kind of tell you about our research here. Thank you so much for joining us. Next week, we have an accounting professor, John Heater, is going to join us, and he will discuss the findings of recent research that suggest newly hired CFOs may face pressure to manage earnings to increase CEO pay. So thanks a lot, guys. I have I think maybe 30 seconds. So let me see if there are any more questions I can maybe take very, very quickly. Oh, yes, there's another one. What would be your recommendations to strengthen America's innovation? Sorry, no, this we discussed. Yeah, so I don't see any more questions. So thank you so much.